The phone rang right as I was locking the lobby doors for the night. I remember that clearly because I'd already flipped the sign to closed and shut off most of the lights, but the desk phone lit up anyway. Outside, snow was just starting to fall, slow, steady flakes against the glass. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. The voice on the other end didn't give a name, just asked if we had a room open. The way he said it, flat quiet, no stammering or small talk, made my stomach tighten a little. He said he was close, asked if we took walk-ins. I said yes. I wish I hadn't. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, especially if you've ever worked a night shift in a place that gets too quiet after dark. And if these stories help you fall asleep, feel free to follow so you don't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened. Back then, I was working the evening desk at a mountain lodge near Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Winter was our slow season, but I liked that less noise, fewer guests, and more time to myself. The lodge sat just off a winding state road nestled among evergreens. It was the kind of place that only showed up on maps if you zoomed in close enough. We mostly got snowmobilers or older couples who came up for quiet weekends. Len Turner, our overnight maintenance guy, handled anything that broke after dark. He was a solid presence, kept mostly to himself, but always reliable. That winter, Len and I were the only staff staying on site during the weekdays. The rest of the team came up Fridays through Sundays when things picked up. That night started like any other wind in the trees. Radio low, coffee cooling on the desk. When the man arrived, I didn't hear his car. The snow had thickened enough to muffle everything, and the lot was already coated in slush. I just looked up and saw him standing outside the glass, his hood pulled low, face mostly in shadow. I unlocked the door and let him in, brushing off the feeling that something was just not quite right. He wasn't dressed for snow, no gloves, no scarf, just a faded black coat that looked like it hadn't been zipped in years. His boots were soaked through. He didn't shiver or stamp his feet. He just stood there, water pooling at his heels. I asked if he was the one who'd called. He nodded once. His eyes never quite met mine. When I asked for his ID, he handed me cash exact change for a single night, no small talk, no hesitation. I still remember the way he placed the bills on the counter. Flat, precise, not folded, not creased. I asked for a name for the ledger, and he just said, Michael, no last name. Just that. The lodge had 15 rooms, and only 3 were occupied that week. I gave him one near the back room 12 end of the west hallway near the fire exit. That wing always stayed a little colder, and the motion lights sometimes took their time flickering on, but I figured it wouldn't matter for one night. He took the key, nodded again, and walked off without a word. No bags. No questions, just boots clicking softly down the tile. I watched him go, then called Len on the radio, told him we had a late check-in just so he'd be aware. Len said he'd seen the guy walking up the path from the woods, not driving walking. That struck me as odd. The nearest bus stop was 12 miles away, and the state road didn't have shoulders, just snowbanks and pine trees. But I didn't press. Some folks like to disappear into the hills. We got all kinds. A few hours passed. I finished closing out the till, turned off the coffee machine, and headed to the staff room to grab my coat. It was a little after 1 a.m. when I finally flicked off the lobby lights. Len radioed to say he'd be doing a quick sweep of the grounds, checking the generator shed before the storm got worse. I told him I'd see him in the morning. That's when I passed the west hallway on my way to the back stairs. All the motion lights were off except just one light at the far end near room 12. It buzzed softly. Flickered, too. The rest of the corridor was completely dark. I stopped just for a second. The air coming from that wing felt colder than it should have. Not icy, just empty, like a place that wasn't supposed to have anyone in it. I told myself it was nothing and went upstairs to bed. My room was 2 floors above the front desk, right next to the linen closet. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up suddenly. Not from a sound, just that kind of waking where your body knows something shifted. The room was quiet, but I could feel it in my chest, like the air had thickened. I lay still listening. A minute passed, then 2. And then I heard it. A knock, not on my door, somewhere below me. Just one knock, slow and flat, then silence. I sat up listening hard. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the old vents, but this was different. This was internal, measured. I got up, stepped into the hallway, and listened. Another knock, this time softer, further off. It was coming from downstairs, not loud, not frantic, just steady. I radioed Len asking if he was still on patrol. No answer. Tried again. Still nothing. I threw on a sweater and my boots and made my way down the stairwell. The lobby was dark, just the glow of the emergency light over the front desk. The hallway motion sensors hadn't triggered, which meant no one had walked through in the last few minutes. I walked quietly past the laundry closet, past the vending machines, and down the west hallway. That single light at the end, still on, still flickering. Room 12's door was closed. Nothing unusual about it, no sound from inside. I stood there for a long moment waiting to hear movement. Another knock came, but this time it sounded like it came from room 14, one door down. Except that room was unoccupied. I double-checked the ledger before bed. I stepped closer. Room 14's doorknob looked untouched. No scuffs, no scratches. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Silence. I walked back down the hallway toward the lobby, telling myself I'd check the security logs in the morning. But as I passed room 12 again, something caught my eye. The peephole. It was dark, but something was pressed against it. Not a finger, not a hand. Just something blocking it from the inside. I couldn't say what. It could have been nothing. Could have been a coat on the hook. But it didn't feel like nothing. Back at the desk, I finally reached Len. He said the shed was fine and he was heading back in. I asked if he'd seen anything near the west wing. He paused, then said, "Thought I saw someone in the snow, near the tree line, watching the building. That was enough for me." I told him I was clocking out a little early. He didn't question it. In the morning, room 12 was empty. The bed was made untouched. Key left on the dresser. No footprints in the hall. Nothing in the trash. No car ever pulled in. Nothing on the exterior cameras. Just a man who walked in during a snowstorm, spent the night in silence, and vanished before sunrise. We never got another call from that number. And I never saw his face in full, just the shape of his coat in the flickering hallway light, and the faint impression of something watching me through the peephole. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people ask, "Are you sure it happened like that?" The kind of thing you end up repeating back to yourself over the years, not because you forgot it, but because you need it to sound less strange than it really was. Back in 2014, I spent most of July staying with my cousin Andre and his family in Montana. They had a place out near Helena, in a village so small it didn't have more than a dozen real roads. I'd just finished my second year of grad school and needed to unplug no email, no notifications, no deadlines, just air and space and quiet. Andre's folks ran a little farm, mostly for self-sufficiency, and they were kind enough to let me stay for a while. He spent most days in town helping out at the co-op, which meant I had the fields to myself. It was peaceful. Long, slow mornings, strong coffee that made my hands jittery, and afternoons filled with nothing but the sound of the wind threading its way through the grass. One morning I decided to take the bike and just wander for a while. There wasn't any plan. I brought a book in my backpack, hoping I might find a nice, shady spot to read for a few hours. The further I rode, the more the landscape thinned. Wheat fields gave way to hills, then wider stretches of open space. Old wooden fences bordered long-forgotten pastures. I wasn't really paying attention to direction until I noticed the path turning to packed dirt beneath my tires, curving between two low hills like it was trying to keep something hidden. That's when I saw the house. At first, it just looked like a ruin. The roof sagged like something heavy had sat on it for years. The windows were boarded, not just covered, but sealed tight wooden slats nailed flush from the inside. That's what stood out. Not weathered plywood like you'd expect from an abandoned property, but warped, dense boards that hadn't come loose despite the passing seasons. It felt wrong somehow, not dramatic, just off, like the place was trying to keep something from getting out. I leaned the bike in the grass and walked toward it, crunching through dry weeds. The air around the house was still so still that I didn't hear birds anymore. No rustling, no insects. Even the wind that had followed me all morning seemed to stop just short of the porch. I peered through a split in one of the boards where the wood had cracked and warped slightly, and that's when I noticed the shoes. Dozens of them. All small. Kids' shoes. Some matched, most didn't. They were scattered across the floor like someone had tossed them in dusty, crooked, just sitting there. But it wasn't random. Something about the way they lay made my stomach tighten. They looked arranged. There were toys, too. A small plastic truck missing its wheels. A wooden block with faded letters. A doll, face-up eyes scratched off. All of it coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust, but not disarrayed. Like the room had been cleaned, then sealed shut, and left for no one. I should have walked away then. Everything in me was starting to signal discomfort, but curiosity is a funny thing. It doesn't shout, it whispers. I circled to the back of the house where part of the wall had rotted inward. There was just enough space between the slats to slide in if I crouched. I told myself I'd just look around, take a few pictures maybe, and head back before anyone noticed. The inside smelled of mold and dry wood, but underneath that was something sharper, metallic sour. I paused and listened. Nothing moved. So I stepped in. The air was warm, heavier than outside. Light filtered through the cracks in sharp, narrow strips. It looked like dust was suspended in place, thick as fog. Every step I took creaked louder than I expected. A broken chair lay in the corner next to a stack of yellowed paper that looked like old pamphlets or catalog pages. I moved past them into what must have once been the living room. That's when I heard the first sound, a dragging scrape coming from the ceiling above me. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. But it was deliberate something moving across the beams, slow and steady, like someone crawling. I froze. My eyes went to the ceiling, to the long, warped plank running from one end of the room to the other. I couldn't see anything, but I didn't need to. My heart had already decided the sound was real. I waited. Nothing followed at first. Then came a knock, 3 times. Not from above, though. This time it came from eye level, somewhere behind me, near one of the windows. I turned slowly, afraid to look too fast. One of the boards had shifted just slightly. Not loose, not cracked, moved. There was now a sliver of space that hadn't been there before, like someone or something had pressed against it from the other side. I stepped back and felt something nudge against my ankle. I looked down, and there it was, a tiny red shoe. Alone. Clean. No dust on it. Sitting right next to my foot, as if it had been placed there quietly, intentionally. I don't remember thinking, I just remember running. I turned back toward the hole in the wall, scraped my arm on a nail, squeezing through, and launched myself toward the bike like I was being chased. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I pedaled until my legs went numb, only slowing once I saw the fence line that marked the edge of Andre's land. That night I didn't say anything. I told myself I must have imagined it. Or maybe the wind moved the board, or maybe someone else had left that shoe behind. I kept replaying it in my head over and over, trying to dull the fear into something manageable. I barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, just as I'd started to drift off, I heard a thump at the window. Just once, not loud, just enough. I sat up in the dark, breath held, and stared at the curtain. It was drawn, but moonlight spilled across the floor in a perfect square, undisturbed. I told myself it was probably a bird, maybe a loose shutter. Anything but what it felt like. The next morning I checked my backpack. I don't know why, I just did. And there it was, that same red shoe, resting on top of my notebook, still spotless. I didn't scream, but I dropped the bag, hard. My first thought was that Andre was messing with me, but he hadn't even come home the night before his girlfriend confirmed it. I didn't tell him what I found. I just took the shoe, walked out behind the property line, and buried it near the edge of the woods. Not deep, just far enough that I didn't have to see it again. That night, the knocking came back. 3 slow taps on the wall near the bed. Spaced out, patient, not threatening, almost like someone checking in. That was the moment I realized what had bothered me most. The boards in that house had been nailed shut from the inside. Whatever had been in there, whatever hadn't left it, had learned how to follow. The next morning, I made up an excuse to cut my visit short. Told Andre that a summer job back home had called unexpectedly and needed me back early. He didn't question it. I left that afternoon. Nothing happened on the drive home. Nothing happened when I got back to the city. For a while, I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that it was stress or a nightmare. Until a week later when I got a package in the mail. No return address, just a small cardboard box neatly wrapped. Inside was the same red shoe, still clean, still untouched. Back in 2016, I took a trip to Peru with my parents. It was the first time we'd ever traveled overseas together, and my mom had dreamed of visiting Lima since she was in college. She was obsessed with old churches and local crafts, and my dad was just happy to wander around anywhere with food stalls and no cell reception. I was 21 and trying not to act like I'd rather be at the beach with friends. But I'll admit, once we found the outdoor flea markets near Miraflores, something shifted. Those markets weren't just colorful, they were alive. Layered sound overlapping music smells of fried dough and motor oil voices, calling out prices in 3 different languages. You could lose yourself just standing still. It was a Saturday late morning. The place was packed shoulder to shoulder in some aisles. My mom was haggling over alpaca scarves my dad had wandered off to look at a booth selling old radios, and I saw a jewelry stall that caught my eye. It wasn't the usual tourist stuff. There was real craftsmanship there. Delicate earrings shaped like tiny snakes, hammered copper bracelets, rings with stones that looked like they came out of the desert itself. One necklace stood out an amber pendant, old-looking but polished. It was beautiful in a way that didn't try to be pretty. The vendor noticed me. He was older, maybe late 50s, with a short gray beard and a calm, steady face. When I reached toward the pendant, he smiled just enough and said, "More pieces in back." Then he lifted a corner of a thick canvas sheet behind him, gesturing like he was letting me in on something special. I hesitated. It wasn't a proper room, just a makeshift space enclosed by cloth and stacked crates. I glanced around. I couldn't see my parents anymore, but I figured they hadn't gone far. I told myself it'd be quick. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled faintly of dust and polish. There were boxes open on a table, some filled with tangled chains, others with carved charms I couldn't quite place. It was darker in there, the light filtering in through the canvas, like the sun through a thin curtain. I stepped in fully, and the vendor let the flap fall closed behind me. Then I heard it, a soft, metallic click. I turned fast. He'd locked it, just a latch and padlock, nothing electronic. He didn't say anything, just walked to the crates and began sifting through them slowly like he was organizing his inventory. No urgency, no acknowledgement that I was watching him frozen. I opened my mouth and told him my parents were looking for me. He didn't respond, just held up a pendant, examined it in the light, then set it back down. I raised my voice, told him again. Still nothing. My heart was racing, but I didn't want to panic too fast. I scanned the space. There was no back exit, just the single flap and wall-to-wall boxes. I stepped toward the crates, thinking I could push them aside and force my way out. I tried the top one. It didn't budge. Too heavy. That's when he spoke, barely loud enough to hear. "You're not ready yet." Those words didn't sound angry or threatening. They sounded final, like a conclusion he'd come to after looking at me. My mouth went dry. I didn't know what he meant, and I didn't want to. I kept trying to figure out whether this was some kind of robbery or something worse. He didn't come closer, didn't even glance my way. After a minute that felt longer than it should have, he walked to a shelf and opened a shallow drawer. Then he pulled out something small photos. 3 of them. He laid them on the table between us, face up. They were Polaroids. The kind with curled edges and that soft sheen older film has. Each one showed a different girl, maybe around my age, standing in the same space I was in now. Same crates in the background, same table. One of the girls wore the amber pendant. None of them were smiling, but they weren't crying either. Their expressions were blank, still. One had her hands clasped behind her back like she'd been standing there for hours. My breath was starting to stutter. I kept glancing at the flap, calculating how much strength it would take to rip the canvas apart. I didn't know how thick the stitching was. I didn't know if I had it in me. Instead, I reached for the edge of the table and shoved it sideways as hard as I could. The boxes on top fell with a loud crash. One of them rolled toward the man and hit his shin. He flinched, not in pain, more in surprise. I didn't wait. I ran to the crates and threw myself against them. One tipped. Something inside cracked. I didn't care. I clawed at the canvas, flap fingers slipping on the fabric. The padlock held, but the seams around it started to give. I yanked again. Threads popped. Somewhere behind me, he was moving now, faster than before, but still not rushing. I could hear the quiet sound of his boots on the tarp-covered ground. The seam finally split just wide enough to get my arm through. I pushed forward and screamed, hoping someone would hear. My head broke through the flap. I could see sunlight, people. A woman in a red dress, a boy holding a soccer ball. No one looked. Then someone did. A teenager, probably a vendor, wearing a yellow apron. His eyes met mine, and for a second he didn't seem to understand what he was seeing. Then he dropped what he was carrying and ran. I heard him shouting Spanish too fast for me to follow, but it got attention. 2 more people came over, and within seconds, hands were pulling crates away from the outside. The man behind me didn't try to stop them. He just stood near the table, watching, calm, still. When the opening finally widened enough for me to crawl out, I didn't look back. I stumbled, tripped over the edge of a crate, and ran. I didn't stop until I saw my mom 3 stalls over holding a woven bag and looking around like she'd just realized I wasn't beside her. That night I told my parents most of it, though not everything. The police were called, but when we returned, the man and his entire booth were gone. Only the torn canvas remained. The crates had been pushed aside, but the space behind them was empty. I gave a full statement, showed them where it happened, described the necklace, the photos, his face. No one recognized him. Nearby vendors said they'd never seen him before. I still have the necklace. The amber one. I don't wear it. I keep it in a drawer wrapped in tissue paper in case someone ever recognizes it. But sometimes I wonder, what did he mean when he said I wasn't ready, and what happens when you are? I don't usually share this story, not because I'm afraid no one will believe me, but because I've already heard every version of disbelief. I've heard the theories, the suggestions, the gentle corrections even from people who were there, but I know what I saw. And more than that, I know what I felt. That's the part people always miss. The feeling that something had already slipped out of reach like reality had tilted just enough for everything familiar to scatter. It was the summer of 2018. We were on a road trip through Nevada trying to make memories for our 9-year-old Lucas before school started again. Just the 3 of us, me, Travis, and our boy, driving through long stretches of desert that felt like they belonged to a different planet. We'd mapped out stops at all the weird roadside attractions, old mining towns, UFO murals, a motel shaped like a teepee. No schedule, no pressure. Just open road and whatever small adventures came our way. That afternoon we were somewhere between Ely and Tonopah. You can drive that stretch for hours without seeing another car. It was late July, the kind of dry heat that makes the pavement shimmer like a mirage. Lucas had fallen asleep in the back seat with his headphones on, and Travis was focused on the road ahead. We spotted a gas station just off the highway, a faded red awning, cracked pavement, no other cars in sight. It looked like it hadn't changed since the 1980s. There was a bug zapper humming by the front door and a vending machine outside with a sun-faded label. We pulled in. Travis stayed by the pump while I brought Lucas inside with me to grab snacks and use the restroom. He was groggy from the nap, dragging his feet, but still excited to pick out candy. Inside, the air smelled like old popcorn and grease. There was a young woman behind the counter, maybe mid-20s, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up. The shelves were only half-stocked, jerky, off-brand soda candy bars that felt soft from the heat. Lucas wandered toward the coolers in the back while I paid. I told him to stay close. It couldn't have been more than 2 minutes, maybe less, but when I turned around, he was gone. I looked behind the shelves, checked the restroom, peeked around the corner. Nothing. I assumed he'd walked outside, maybe to talk to Travis, but when I stepped back into the heat and asked, Travis looked confused. He said Lucas hadn't come out, not even once. That's when the panic hit me, not slowly, immediately. I ran around both sides of the building yelling his name. Nothing. I checked behind the dumpster in the restroom again. My voice started to rise sharper, louder. Travis stormed inside and asked the cashier if they had security cameras. She seemed startled, like we'd accused her of something. She mumbled something and called someone. I paced the parking lot until an older man in jeans and a sweat-stained flannel arrived. Said his name was Daryl, owner of the station. We followed him into a back room through a curtain of wooden beads. The air was stale and hot. There was an old monitor mounted on the wall showing 4 angles: the gas pumps, the lot, the front door, and a side alley. Daryl hit rewind. There was Lucas, clear as day, standing near the vending machine. He was talking to a man in a hoodie and a baseball cap, despite the heat. The man glanced around, then motioned for Lucas to follow him around the side of the building. Lucas hesitated, then stepped off camera. I pointed at the screen and shouted. I asked Daryl to rewind it again to zoom in to do something. He just stared at the screen and then looked at me. Never seen that kid before, he said. You sure he came in with you? I felt like the air left the room. I turned to the cashier. She blinked and said I came in alone. Swore she never saw a child. We called the police. Daryl didn't stop us, but he acted like we were being dramatic. The troopers arrived about 40 minutes later. We gave our statements. They asked the cashier, then followed Daryl to the back room. We stayed outside. I watched the bug zapper flash and heard my own heartbeat in my ears. One of the troopers made a face when he saw the footage, confused, skeptical. When they came back out, the younger one told us the footage didn't show anything unusual. No boy, no man. Just me entering the store and Travis pumping gas. I thought he was joking. I demanded to see it again. I insisted I had watched the tape with my own eyes. But the troopers were polite, careful. They said they couldn't act on anything that wasn't there. We left in silence. The whole drive back to the motel, I stared at Lucas's backpack in the back seat. It was still there. The one with the dinosaur patches he picked out himself. I remembered helping him pack it that morning. I remembered brushing his hair off his forehead as he napped. That night, Travis barely slept. I sat on the edge of the bed, refreshing local Facebook groups, messaging anyone who might have seen something. It felt like time had snapped and we were stuck in the wrong version of it. I called the gas station the next morning. Daryl answered. His voice was rough, like he'd just woken up. I asked about the footage. He said there was no kid, no tape, and nothing to talk about. We drove back anyway. The lot looked the same. Empty, faded, the same crack in the pavement. When I walked in, the cashier didn't seem to recognize me. I asked about the cameras. She looked confused and said the monitors were just for show. No cameras were ever installed. I asked when Daryl would be back. She shrugged. We sat in the car for hours, hoping someone, anyone, would walk out from behind the building. A man in a hoodie, a kid in a red shirt. Nothing, just the wind and the sun, and the long, empty road ahead. Later that week, we got a call from another officer just following up. She sounded distant, cautious. Said a report had been filed, but there were no updates. She asked if we wanted to come back in and look at some images from the pump camera. When we did, the screenshots were blurry. None showed Lucas. Not even his reflection. Just Travis pumping gas. Just me walking in alone. I called the station's main office in Reno. They told me that location hadn't had working cameras in years. No maintenance logs, no employee named Daryl, nothing matched. Weeks passed, then months. Flyers went unanswered. Forums went silent. No tips, no sightings. Just a backpack that stayed in our back seat for longer than I'd like to admit. There's no official explanation. On paper, Lucas vanished somewhere outside Ely, Nevada. That's all it says. But I remember. I remember the tape. I remember the man in the hoodie. I remember the hesitation in my son's posture just before he stepped out of frame. That memory is louder than any evidence, and nothing, no version of reality can convince me it didn't happen. Back in 2021, I booked a solo trip to the San Juan Islands. It wasn't meant to be anything profound, just a break. A chance to get out of Seattle and breathe a little slower. I'd landed a decent freelance contract that paid out early, and I told myself I deserved a few days of quiet. I'd been working on a personal photo series called Solitude in the Pacific Northwest, and the idea of fog, coastline, and stillness felt like a kind of medicine. Looking back, I don't think it was the place I needed to escape. I think it was the silence I wasn't ready for. The ferry to the island wasn't crowded, maybe 15 people tops. A few tourists, some locals with bags of groceries, and a guy who looked like he'd been standing in the same spot for hours. He was wearing a faded green parka zipped up to the chin, even though it wasn't especially cold. He didn't have a phone. No bag. Just stood near the railing the entire ride, hands in his pockets, occasionally glancing around, not at the scenery, but at people. At me. His gaze wasn't aggressive, just too still. When someone looks through you like that, it sticks in your head. Once we docked, everyone sort of disappeared on foot in cars off to rentals and shops. I lingered for a few minutes gathering my gear and tightening the straps on my tripod case. By the time I stepped onto the pier, he was already to the side, leaning against a utility post. No luggage, no motion toward town. He didn't look at me directly, but I felt his head turn when I passed. The guest house I'd rented was about a 10-minute walk from the dock. A one-story home tucked behind some tall hedges, owned by a retired couple who left the key in a mailbox with a note to make myself comfortable. The place was tidy. pine walls, faint citrus cleaner in the air, ticking baseboard heater that barely kept up. My room had a wide desk under the window and a bed with a too-stiff pillow, but I didn't mind. I unpacked, showered, and reviewed a few shots on my camera. By the time I lay down, the sky outside had gone a kind of dull violet, the kind that doesn't give you stars, just a vague sense that the dark is heavier here. I hadn't even drawn the curtains yet when I noticed movement outside, just a small shift enough to catch in the corner of my eye. I sat up. Across the road, lit only by the orange hue of a street lamp, stood the man from the ferry. Same green parka, same stillness. He wasn't walking. He wasn't doing anything, just standing behind a thin tree trunk that barely covered him, head tilted slightly, looking up toward my window. I closed the curtain fast, not out of panic, but instinct. My hands stayed on the fabric. I waited. A few minutes passed, maybe more. I peeked again. He was gone. No sound, no retreating footsteps, no rustling gravel. Just the empty road, the porch light buzz, and one moth fluttering near the glass. I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up, the creak of floorboards, the hum of the heater, cycling on the occasional shift of branches in the wind. I considered walking back to the dock and waiting for the morning ferry, but the roads were unlit, winding, and the idea of being caught in the open felt worse than staying put. I wedged a chair under the door handle, turned off the lights, and watched the street from the smallest crack in the curtain. The next morning, I went out early to shoot the cliffs and beaches before sunrise. The island was wrapped in mist so thick it felt like the air was absorbing every sound. I tried to shake off the night before, focused on lighting exposure motion blur. Got a few decent frames. Around 11, I stopped by a diner on the edge of town. I asked the waitress if there were any other inns nearby besides the main ones. She paused before answering. Said most people who come in on the late ferry already have reservations. She said it was rare for anyone to be on the island without a plan. That night felt heavier. Not colder, just more still. I edited a few shots, texted a friend back in Seattle, then checked every door and window. Locked them all. I even pushed a small shelf in front of the back door that led to the kitchen. It wasn't paranoia. It was something closer to habit, like my body had decided on its own that this was the right move. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the porch. Not a fox, not branches, actual footsteps, slow, intentional. They stopped just outside the guest room door. The walls were thin, and it felt like the sound had entered the room, even though the door never opened. My phone had no signal. I remembered too late that I hadn't tested the back door. The one through the kitchen, the one facing the woods. I got up, moved quietly down the hallway. Every floorboard felt loud, like it was trying to betray me. The kitchen smelled like pine cabinets and whatever the owners used to clean the counters. The curtain over the back door was thin, barely there. I reached for the knob and turned it. Unlocked, I held my breath, then slowly pulled the curtain aside. At first, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted. He was standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. Same green coat, still not moving, watching. No flashlight, no bag, no reason. I didn't open the door. I stepped back, locked it, and braced a stool under the handle. My hands shook, but I stayed quiet. I grabbed the knife from the block, not because I thought it would help, just to hold something. I returned to the guest room and sat by the window. Lights off. Curtain cracked just enough to watch the road. He didn't leave. Not for 30 minutes. Not for 40. He just stood there. Then finally he turned. Not toward the road, toward the woods. And he walked slow, deliberate, until the dark swallowed him again. I left the next morning, knocked on the owner's door around 6 and told them something felt off. They didn't press. The husband scratched his head and said other guests had seen figures before, always at night, always near the edges of the property. But there were never footprints, no broken twigs, just sightings. I never finished the photo series. When I got back and reviewed the shots, one of the shoreline frames caught my attention. Way in the background near a pile of driftwood was a small, upright shape, far away, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. A green parka. I never went back to the island, and I don't take solo trips anymore. Not because of what happened, but because I noticed him. That's what I can't let go of. I looked too long. I met his gaze, and maybe that's all it ever takes. I've worked most of my life with schedules, track maps, and two-tone horns, so when I finally retired, the hardest part wasn't the stillness. It was choosing where to go next. I didn't want a cruise or anything fancy. I just wanted to visit some of the quieter corners of the country I'd passed by without ever seeing. That's how I ended up in Wallace, Idaho, renting a converted attic apartment above an old Victorian home for 3 nights in the fall of 2019. It was cheap, simple, and just out of season enough that the town felt paused, like it hadn't decided whether to hibernate or wake up again. The host's name was Evelyn. She met me on the porch the evening I arrived, smiling but reserved like someone who'd been burned by guests before. Her hair was white and pinned in a careful twist, and she spoke softly, giving me the tour like she was used to being ignored. The stairs to the attic groaned the whole way up, and when she opened the door, I remember noticing how bare everything felt. A twin bed, a narrow dresser, 1 lamp, and a wooden rocking chair that faced a small, rain-streaked window overlooking the backyard. She told me the Wi-Fi sometimes dropped during storms, but that the heater worked fine. I thanked her, and she paused at the door before leaving. Said something like, "If you hear things at night, it's just the roof settling. This house has got a memory." That first night was uneventful. I read a little, made some tea, and tried the rocking chair out just for the novelty. There was a strange draft near the back wall, but I figured it was just poor insulation. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to a light scratching sound, very faint, like something brushing against wood. I sat up, listened hard, but it stopped. I told myself it was tree branches, and I fell back asleep. The second day I spent walking around town. Wallace is small, mostly old mining shops turned into cafes and antique bookstores. I ended up chatting with the owner of a gift shop who asked where I was staying. When I described the house, she raised her eyebrows and said, "Evelyn's place." Huh. Didn't think she'd still be renting that attic after the thing with the last guy. I asked what she meant, but she shrugged and said it wasn't her story to tell. That stuck with me. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something carved into the bottom edge of the mirror. The glass was mounted above the dresser, and the lighting was poor, but when I tilted my head and squinted, I could make out 3 words etched lightly into the wood frame. "Don't sit there." I stepped back and looked around. The only place someone might be warning me about was the rocking chair. It was the only object in the room that felt deliberate, like someone had chosen its position carefully, facing the window overlooking nothing but dark trees and the corner of an old garden shed. I didn't sit in it that night. In fact, I dragged it to the far wall, turned it to face the slanted ceiling, and went to bed early. At 2:47 a.m., I woke up again. Not from a sound, but from absence, like something had gone quiet all at once. No wind, no distant cars, not even the creak of the house. I sat up and turned toward the window. The rocking chair was back. Not just back in the same spot it was, at the exact angle I'd found it when I arrived, facing the window with its legs tilted just slightly, like someone had stood up from it recently. I didn't go near it. I stayed in bed, my mouth dry, hands under the covers like I was 10 years old again. At some point, the faint scratching returned this time, from the attic wall behind the bed. I counted the seconds between each sound, sometimes 3, sometimes 5, then 7 in a row with nothing. Eventually, I must have dozed off. The next morning, I asked Evelyn if anyone else had keys to the unit. She said no. I asked as casually as I could if there had been any issues with previous guests. She hesitated and said, "Most people don't stay more than one night up there anymore. Not since Brian." I didn't push further. Instead, I walked into town and found the public library. It still had a microfilm reader and a collection of local news clippings going back decades. It took a while, but I found a short article from 2 years earlier. A man named Brian Jessup had been reported missing. Last seen staying in Wallace. The only address listed was Evelyn's. There were no follow-ups, no mention of him being found. I tried searching online, but there was nothing recent. It was like he'd just been erased. Back at the house, I left the lights on, every one of them. I didn't sleep that night. Around 1:00 a.m., I heard a dull creak from the attic floorboards. Not footsteps exactly, more like weight shifting, rocking, then stillness. I stayed in bed, heart pounding, eyes locked on the crack beneath the door. At 2:47, something cast a faint shadow across the floor. It didn't linger. Just passed once, slow and smooth, like someone moving past the window on the porch outside. But I was 3 stories up. There was no porch. The next morning, I packed my bags before sunrise. I left Evelyn a note thanking her and locked the door behind me. As I walked down the stairs, I heard something slide across the floor upstairs. A single wooden scrape, like a chair being dragged into place. I didn't look back. I was coming back from a long week in Boston, driving with no real urgency, just meandering through Pennsylvania, when a heavy fog rolled in around dusk. It was the kind of fog that swallowed the road in both directions, making it feel like you were floating in place. Headlights useless against the soft, glowing gray. I didn't want to push on through it, so I pulled into the next town that had a vacancy sign lit up. Kingsbridge. I'd never heard of it before, and I haven't heard of it since. The B&B sat on a quiet street, a 2-story colonial-style house with dark shutters and a wraparound porch that creaked as I stepped onto it. A small brass plaque beside the door read, "The Pines, Esther 1902, and there was a bell to ring instead of a doorbell. The woman who answered was polite but distracted. Her name was Angela, maybe mid-60s, hair pulled back tightly like she didn't want it to move. She told me I was lucky. Someone had just canceled last minute, so the room upstairs was available. But she paused halfway through unlocking the front door and said almost apologetically, "It may not feel quite settled yet." The man who stayed there last left in a hurry. That didn't mean much to me at the time. I just wanted a warm room and a clean bed. She handed me a real key, not a card, and showed me upstairs. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and something older underneath, something more permanent like dry leaves. My room was small but charming. White walls, dark wood furniture, a bay window with pale yellow curtains. It was all so ordinary, but I remember feeling watched the moment I stepped in. Angela didn't linger. She handed me the key, nodded once, and said, "Let me know if the window bothers you. It sticks." I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but by the time I turned to ask, she was already halfway down the stairs. That first night, I unpacked my camera gear, stretched out on the bed, and tried to edit a few photos on my laptop. But the fog outside made the room feel more like a snow globe sealed off from the world, still and unreal. I kept glancing toward the bay window. There was something strange about it, though I couldn't have told you what. Maybe it was the fact that I couldn't remember seeing that side of the house from outside. At around 1:00 a.m., I was still awake when I heard a click. Not loud, but sharp enough to make me sit up. The window latch had opened on its own. I got up to check it, but the glass wouldn't budge. It was stuck fast, just like Angela said. The fog pressed up against the glass from the outside, like it had substance, like it was trying to see in. I latched it shut again and went back to bed, though I didn't sleep well. Around 2:47 a.m., I woke to the soft sound of breathing. Not mine, slower, deeper, just beyond the edge of hearing. I stayed still, heart thudding, and stared up at the ceiling until it stopped. The window remained latched. The next morning, over a breakfast of toast and eggs in the dining room, I asked Angela about the previous guest. She hesitated, then said, "Curtis, he was here for 2 weeks, didn't say goodbye, just left the key on the table and drove off in the middle of the night." I asked if anything had happened, and she offered a tight smile. Only thing he ever complained about was the window. Said he felt like something watched him from it, even with the curtains drawn. That night I tried to brush it off. People get paranoid when they're alone. Rooms have creaks and sighs and drafts. I left the curtains closed and read until late. Around midnight I saw something move behind them. Not a shadow exactly. More like a change in pressure, a sense of something leaning close. I pulled the curtains back fast. Nothing there, just fog. But when I pressed my hand to the glass, it was warm. The rest of the window was cold. Just that one spot roughly the height of a human face. At 2:47 a.m., the latch clicked open again. I didn't sleep. I sat up, lights on, staring at the window. The fog thinned around that time, just enough for me to see across the narrow yard to a stand of trees at the back of the property. Someone was standing there, not moving, not shifting weight or swaying, just perfectly still. I got up and went to the window. When I blinked, they were gone. The next morning, I told Angela I'd be checking out early. She didn't look surprised, just nodded and handed me a paper receipt with a faintly smudged date in the corner, same day I arrived. But as I turned to leave, she said, "If you think of it, check the photos you took while you were here. Sometimes the window leaves impressions." I didn't look until I was 2 towns away, sitting in a diner with my camera plugged into the laptop. Most of the shots were boring fog road signage, but in one frame of the room taken before I unpacked anything, the bay window reflected something behind me. A person. Except I'd been alone. Their reflection showed them sitting in the chair by the window, facing out, head tilted like they were listening. I don't know how long the room had been empty before me. I don't know what Curtis saw or why he left the way he did. But I haven't booked a stay through a hand-lettered sign or accepted a last-minute cancellation since. Sometimes the quietest places leave the deepest marks. A borrowed attic, a fogged-in roadside lodge, an empty diner near closing time. These aren't grand haunted houses or famous crime scenes. They're normal places that become strange just enough to stick with you. And when they do, it's rarely the moment itself that haunts you. It's what lingers afterward. The unsaid thing, the sound you can't prove. You heard the object that wasn't quite where you left it. That's the thread I see running through all of these stories. Not terror, not tragedy. Just the subtle hum of something that doesn't quite want to be seen, but waits anyway. Maybe that's why we remember these moments. Not because they screamed at us, but because they almost didn't. I don't know if these stories offer any answers. They might not even be warnings. But they've stayed with me like static in the background of memory. And if you're still listening, maybe you've felt that too. Maybe one of these stories brushed close to something you've never spoken out loud. Just something to think about before you turn off the light. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. If these stories settled into your mind the way they did mine, I hope you'll follow the channel, subscribe, or share it with someone who enjoys a quiet chill before sleep. And tell me, have you ever stayed somewhere that felt off in a way you couldn't explain? I'd like to hear about it. Sleep well tonight.